Welcome back. In this video, I will explain you the basic Unity terminology and keywords which we will use throughout the course. These keywords are used in other game engines as well, so not just in Unity. So it's really important to understand them. So let's look at this infographic right here. In every game, there will be a scene or multiple scenes. A scene is a 3D space where stuff exists. And by stuff, I mean our game content, like characters such as the player or the NPCs, so the non-playable characters, and even buildings, trees, and boxes. Every object which is part of our game content, we will call a game object. A game object is just a component container. Its only purpose is to contain components, nothing more and nothing less. A component is the body and soul of our game object, and components are what define our game objects. Finally, we have assets, which are files that our component needs as resources. Assets could be anything from textures, 3D models to audio files. To sum it up, we have a scene which contains game objects, and game objects contain components that use assets. Let's say we want to add a candle in our game. For this, we will need to create a game object that represents a candle. If we think about it, to display a candle in 3D, we will need a 3D model of a candle, the texture of the candle model, the light that will be emitted from the candle's wick. To achieve this, we will first add an empty game object. We will notice that this empty game object doesn't do anything, it doesn't show anything, because it does not have any component yet. Then we will add a component to this empty game object which will render and draw something on the screen. Let's call this component a renderer. Now we have a game object that has a rendering component called renderer, but it still doesn't display anything. This is because the renderer component will need a 3D model, which is going to be the asset that our rendering component is going to draw on the screen. So now we will see a 3D model of a candle, but it's white. That's because, as we said, the assets are the resources that our components will use. And since we did not give our rendering component the textures for the 3D model, it did not give it any color. Now, if we add the textures to our rendering component, we have a color, and here you can see we have cool red candles. Now there is still something missing here, and that's the light. Every component should have only one responsibility. To make our candle emit light, we will have to add a light component. So now we will add a light component which is responsible for emitting light. So you see, now we have an awesome candle in our game. So to sum it up, first we created an empty game object and we added two components. The renderer component, which took the 3D model and its textures to draw it, to render it on the screen, so to speak. So rendering is to draw in this case. Then we have the light component, which emits light from the tip of the candle. These components are what defined our candle game object. Because every game object will behave depending on the components it contains, we call them behavior components. To sum it up, we have a scene which contains game objects, and game objects contain components that use assets. All these game objects together represent our game. So that's what makes our game, so to speak. So now let's jump into Unity and see all this theory in action.